The gun was already out. The crowd was already screaming. And Dex Carter, the man who had one rule, was bleeding on the floor with Isla's hands pressed against his chest, her voice cracking open like she'd never been trained to hide anything. "Don't you dare," she whispered. "Don't you dare leave me alone in this." Before we dive into this story, please subscribe, like, and drop in the comments. Where are you watching from? The alarm on Dex Carter's phone went off at 5:03 a.m., the same as every morning, and the same as every morning, he was already awake. He lay on his back in his apartment on the north side of Chicago, staring at the ceiling the way other men stared at screens, searching for something, finding nothing. The apartment was clean in the way that hurt to look at. No pictures on the walls. No dishes in the sink. A single coffee mug on the counter, washed and dried and turned upside down, waiting. He sat up, rolled his neck. The scar along his left collarbone caught the gray pre-dawn light the way it always did, a pale ridge of raised skin that a certain kind of person would ask about and a certain kind of person would know better than to. Dex was surrounded almost entirely by the second kind. He worked for Hargrove Security, one of Chicago's most respected private protection firms. 6 years in, and he had built a reputation so clean and so controlled it had become almost a myth among the other agents. Dex doesn't get rattled. Dex doesn't make mistakes. Dex doesn't get close. That last one was the one that mattered. He'd learned it the hard way. 3 years ago, on a protection detail in Phoenix, a client he let himself care about, a situation he let himself believe was under control, and then Danny Chun, his partner of 4 years, catching a bullet meant for the client because Dex had been 2 seconds slow. 2 seconds distracted. 2 seconds human. Danny had survived. Barely. But something in Dex hadn't. He pulled on dark jeans and a gray thermal, drank his coffee standing at the window watching the city begin to breathe, and then picked up the file that had been sitting on his kitchen counter for 3 days. Isla Monroe, 29. Daughter of Richard Monroe, Monroe Property Group. The photo in the file showed a woman at some kind of charity gala, dark hair swept up, a smile aimed at whoever was holding the camera. It was a good smile. The kind that had been practiced. Dex had spent enough years reading people to know the difference between a smile that came from somewhere real and one that was built for an audience. Hers was built for an audience. There had been 2 threats in the past month. Emails, both untraceable so far, sent to her personal account. The language had been specific enough to be credible. Richard Monroe had called Hargrove on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Thursday morning, Dex had been assigned. He closed the file. Finished his coffee. Picked up his jacket. "Don't get close," he reminded himself. "Watch the exits." Not her face. Isla Monroe was running late, which was not unusual, and arguing with her assistant on the phone, which was also not unusual, and standing in her closet in a silk robe staring at 400 square feet of clothing she didn't want to wear, which was the most usual thing of all. "I don't need a bodyguard, Priya," she said, wedging the phone between her ear and shoulder while she reached for a blazer. "Your father." "My father also thought I needed a nutritionist, a life coach, and a social media consultant by the time I was 25. My father has opinions." Isla. Priya's voice dropped into its warning register. The emails weren't vague. The last one had your parking garage code. The blazer stayed in her hand. Isla stood very still for a moment. She'd read the emails. Twice, actually. Then she'd closed her laptop and gone for a run because she refused to be a woman who lived afraid in her own apartment. She had spent too many years inside the careful management of her father's world, too many years being steered and scheduled and protected to give any more ground to fear. But the parking garage code. Yeah. That one had sat in her chest like a stone. "Fine," she said. 1 week. And I don't want someone hovering over me at every meeting. He'll be professional. His name is Dex Carter." Dex Carter. She pulled the blazer on. Great. Another man in a dark suit telling me where to stand. Her apartment was on the 22nd floor of a glass tower in River North, the kind of place that looked like a magazine spread and felt, on certain quiet Sunday evenings, like a very elegant prison. She had chosen it herself, which made it better. She had decorated it herself, which made it hers. But it was still, at its core, a place her father had paid for, in a life her father had largely designed. She was working on that part. She had a pitch meeting at 10, her own project, a sustainable development proposal she'd been building for 18 months, completely independent of Monroe Property Group. Her father didn't know about it yet. That fact alone made her feel more alive than anything else in her week. The lobby intercom buzzed at 8:47 a.m. She picked it up. "Ms. Monroe. Dex Carter, Hargrove Security. I'm downstairs." The voice was even, unhurried. The voice of a man who was never, she guessed, caught off guard. She pressed the button. "Come up." She met him at the door. He was taller than she'd expected. Not that she'd expected anything, she told herself quickly. Dark brown skin, close-cut hair, a face arranged in the specific neutral expression of someone who had decided long ago not to let it show anything. Dark jacket. No tie. He held a small credentials folder open in one hand with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. His eyes moved, quick and methodical, from her face to the hallway behind him, to the interior of the apartment, to her face again. Dex Carter. He put the credentials away. "I've reviewed the threat file. I'd like to walk your space before we discuss your schedule for the week." Not hello. Not nice to meet you. Not I'll try not to get in your way. "Be my guest," she said, stepping back. She watched him move through her apartment, living room, kitchen, the hallway toward the bedroom, which he stopped at the entrance of without entering. He checked the window locks. He noted the second exit. He did all of it in under 4 minutes and said nothing while he did it, and Isla had the strange, uncomfortable feeling of being assessed without being looked at, which was, she realized, the opposite of what she usually experienced from men. He came back to the living room. "Your balcony door doesn't lock completely. I'd like to address that today. And your building's camera coverage has a blind spot in the east stairwell. I'll follow up with building security." "Okay," she said. A pause. "Is that it?" she asked. "For the space assessment. Do you have somewhere you need to be at 10? "A meeting in the Loop. I'll need to drive." "I'll drive," he said. Simply. As if it weren't a negotiation. Isla studied him for a moment. He was looking at his phone, a compact, deliberate glance, already moving into logistics. He hasn't really looked at me, she thought. Not the way people usually did. Not with the particular awareness that came with knowing who her father was, or what her face looked like in a gala photograph. She didn't know yet whether that bothered her or was the first relief she'd felt all week. "Fine," she said. "Coffee first." "I've had mine." "I wasn't offering you any," she said, and something, the faintest edge of something, moved across his face before it settled back into stillness. She turned toward the kitchen. He stayed in the doorway, exactly where a professional should stand, watching the room. And outside, 17 floors down, a man in a gray sedan had been parked across the street since 7 a.m., watching the building's front entrance with the focused, patient attention of someone who had already decided how this was going to end. Dex felt it before he could name it, a stillness in his chest he hadn't felt in 3 years. He told himself it was threat assessment. He told himself it was training. He told himself a lot of things, standing in that doorway. But he watched her move through her kitchen, just a woman making coffee, nothing remarkable, nothing dangerous, and something in his carefully constructed silence shifted. He pressed it down. Hard. "Don't get close. Watch the exits, not her face." He watched the exits. If you've ever had to talk yourself out of something your heart had already decided, this story knows that feeling. Stay with it. It's just getting started. The pitch meeting ran long. Isla had expected that. What she hadn't expected was how good it would feel, sitting across from 3 serious people in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a building she had walked into on her own terms, pitching an idea that had no Monroe name attached to it, watching their faces shift from polite attention to genuine interest as she walked them through 18 months of research, sketches, and financial projections. She'd built the proposal from scratch. Sustainable mixed-use development on Chicago's South Side, affordable housing units stacked above green commercial space, solar infrastructure, community garden access on every 3rd floor. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't the kind of thing her father built. That was exactly the point. When she walked out of the conference room at 12:14 p.m., her heels clicking against the marble lobby floor, she was smiling without meaning to. Dex was standing exactly where she'd left him, near the building's east wall, back straight, eyes moving across the lobby the way they always did, cataloging exits and faces and angles with the quiet efficiency of a man who never fully turned off. He'd been there for 2 hours. She wondered if he'd moved at all. He saw her coming and straightened slightly. His eyes went to her face, that quick professional assessment, and then, just for a half-second, something registered. Not a smile. Not quite. But a fractional softening around his eyes that she almost missed. "How'd it go?" he asked. She blinked. In 3 days, he had asked her approximately 0 personal questions. "Good," she said, and then, because the feeling in her chest was too big to compress into one word, "Really good, actually." He nodded. "Car's out front. You have a lunch reservation at 1. And we're back," she thought. "Cancel it," she said. "I want to walk." A pause. "Ms. Monroe." "Isla." She'd told him 3 times now. "And it's 12:15 in the afternoon on a public street in downtown Chicago, Dex. I think I can survive a walk." He didn't argue. But she noticed the way he repositioned, slightly ahead and to her left, one hand loose at his side, eyes already moving to the sidewalk ahead. Always angled between her and the street. She'd started noticing things like that. The small, constant adjustments he made. The way he was always, quietly, between her and whatever might be coming. It should have felt suffocating. It didn't. They walked 2 blocks without speaking. The November air was sharp and bright, the kind of Chicago cold that didn't apologize for itself. Isla had her coat open because she always ran warm and because some part of her resisted being managed even by the weather. "Where'd you grow up?" she asked. He glanced at her sideways. "Detroit." "Siblings?" "1 brother." "Older or younger?" "Younger." A beat. "Why?" "I'm making conversation," she said. "I talk to people I spend 8 hours a day with. It's a character flaw." Something moved across his face again. That almost thing. South Side. Single mom. "My brother's an electrician in Dearborn." "Do you see him much?" "When I can." She heard what lived under that answer, which isn't often, and let it be. They stopped at a corner. Isla was looking at a food cart across the street. Chicago-style hot dogs, a line of 6 people, steam rising in the cold air, and she was already moving toward it before she'd made a conscious decision. "Isla." Dex's voice came out sharper than usual. "It's a hot dog cart, Dex. You have a reservation." "That I canceled." She was already crossing. "Come on. Live a little." She heard him exhale behind her. Not quite a sigh. More like a man recalibrating. They stood in line. She ordered 2. When she turned and held one out to him, he looked at it the way she imagined he looked at most things that fell outside his protocols, with a careful, considering stillness. He took it. She watched him take a bite and look out at the street and say nothing, and she thought there. Under all that control, there was a person. She'd been catching glimpses for 3 days, and it was starting to feel like a project she hadn't meant to start. They were walking back toward the car, Isla half a step ahead, the crowds thinning as they turned off the main street into a quieter block near the parking structure, when it happened. She heard it before she understood it. A sharp, hard crack. Then screaming, not a lot of it, just 2 or 3 voices, sudden and panicked, from somewhere behind and to the left. Then the sound of running feet on pavement and a voice, male, close, too close, shouting something she couldn't parse. She turned. The man was already moving toward her. He was maybe 30 feet away, gray jacket, face she didn't recognize, something in his right hand that her brain refused to process for 1 terrible second before it did, and then Dex was there. Not in front of her. Around her. His arm came across her body, not grabbing, just a hard, certain pressure at her shoulders, and he turned her into him, putting his own back to the street, his body between her and whatever was coming, one hand pressing her face into his chest and the other coming up with his weapon drawn in a single motion so smooth it didn't seem real. "Gun!" Someone on the street shouted. More screaming. Isla's face was pressed against Dex's chest. She could feel his heartbeat, fast, controlled, nothing like hers, and his hand at the back of her head, holding her down and in and safe with a firmness that was the most certain thing she had ever felt in her life. She heard him shout, "Federal agent, drop it." The way she imagined he'd been trained to, voice stripped of everything human and turned into pure authority. A shot. A single crack that split the air so close she felt it in her teeth. Dex's body jerked. His grip on her tightened for 1 fierce second. Involuntary, she realized later, a body's last protective reflex, And then his voice, lower now, right against the top of her head, "Stay down." She heard feet. Running. A second set behind them, the plainclothes officer who'd been working with Dex's firm, she found out later, and shouting, and the sounds of someone being brought to the ground. And then stillness. Dex stepped back. His hand left her head. She looked up. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before, a tightness at the jaw, eyes sharper than usual. He was looking at her the way a man looked when he needed to confirm something was real. "Are you hurt?" His voice was different. Lower. The professional layer had cracked open just slightly, and underneath it was something raw and immediate. "No," she said. "Are you?" She saw it then. The left side of his jacket. The dark stain spreading slowly, too slowly, through the dark fabric. "Dex." Her voice came out strange. Not the voice she used in conference rooms or at galas or on the phone with her father. "Dex, you're—" "It's a graze," he said. "I need you to stay. You're bleeding." She had already moved toward him. Her hand came up, not thinking, just moving, the way hands moved when the body decided the rules didn't apply anymore, and pressed flat against his side. He went completely still. Not from pain. She understood that immediately. He went still the way a person went still when something happened that they had no protocol for, no training, no prepared response. Her hand on his side. Both of them standing on a sidewalk with the city still screaming around them. His blood warm against her palm. He looked down at her hand. Then up at her face. "Don't touch the client." The rule had been so clear. So absolute. 3 years of clean, unbroken discipline, and a wound in Phoenix that still lived in his sleep. He had touched her first. He had pulled her into his body and held her against his chest and pressed his hand to the back of her head and chosen her safety over every wall he'd ever built. And now she was touching him. And the world had narrowed down to exactly this. Her eyes, wide and dark and frightened, and something else that he couldn't look at directly, and her hand against his ribs, and the absolute wreckage of every careful thing he had constructed. "Dex." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Look at me." He did. It was the first time he had really looked at her. Not the professional scan. Not the assessment. Looked at her. And something in his face, years and years of controlled nothing, moved. "I'm okay," he said quietly. "I've got you." Her eyes filled. She blinked it back hard, proud even now, even here, but one tear broke through anyway, tracking down her cheek before she could stop it. His hand came up. His thumb, careful and slow and deliberate, a choice he made with full knowledge of everything it cost, brushed that tear from her cheek. 3 years of one rule. Gone. Not with a kiss. Not with words. With a thumb against her cheekbone on a Chicago sidewalk while sirens wailed in the distance, and her hand was still pressed flat against his bleeding side. Isla exhaled, a long, unsteady breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 days. "You broke your rule," she said softly. The ghost of something, not quite a smile, too fragile for that, moved across her mouth. "Yeah," Dex said. His voice was rough. His eyes didn't leave her face. "I did." The sirens were getting closer now. He would have to step back. He would have to rebuild the wall, re-establish the distance, return to the protocols that had kept him intact for 3 years. He knew that. He stepped back anyway. But his hand, the one that had just touched her face, stayed at his side for a long moment, fingers slightly open, like it was waiting to be told what to do with itself now that it had forgotten all the rules. Some people spend their whole lives being protected and never once feel safe, until someone breaks every rule they were taught just to keep them. Subscribe, like, and drop a comment. Every person who stays with this story is proof that real love, the kind that breaks rules and bleeds for you, still matters. Don't let Dex and Isla's story go unseen. The hospital was a particular kind of quiet that Dex hated. Not silent, never silent, with the PA system and the rolling carts and the shoes squeaking on linoleum, but muffled. Like the world had been turned down 2 notches and everyone inside it was moving through something they hadn't agreed to. He sat on the edge of the examination table in a curtained bay in the ER at Northwestern Memorial, shirt off, while a nurse named Gerald worked on the grays along his left side with the efficient disinterest of a man who had seen far worse on a slow Tuesday. Which, Dex understood he had. "You're lucky," Gerald said, pressing gauze firmly against the wound. "Another inch and we're having a different conversation." "I know," Dex said. You want something for the pain? No. Gerald gave him the look that medical professionals reserved for stubborn men and continued working. Dex stared at the curtain in front of him and focused on his breathing the way he'd been trained to do when his body was sending signals his mind didn't want to receive. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The Navy had taught him that. The years after had made it a reflex. He did not think about the sidewalk. He did not think about her hand against his ribs. He did not think about the tear. Or his thumb. Or the way her voice had said his name in that register, Dex, like it was something breakable and she was being careful with it. He thought about the threat. The man in the gray jacket. The weapon. The intelligence failure that had allowed someone to get that close in a public space in broad daylight. He thought about the debrief he'd need to run with the Hargrove team, the security protocol adjustments, the question of whether this had been a targeted attempt or an opportunistic escalation. He thought about everything except the thing he was actually thinking about. Gerald finished, taped the bandage, and told him to keep it dry for 48 hours with the energy of a man who knew full well that would not happen. When the curtain opened, Isla was there. She'd been in the waiting area, he'd made sure of that, had spoken to the attending officer and confirmed she was secure and accompanied before he'd let Gerald touch him. He'd been informed she was calm. He'd been informed she was fine. She did not look fine. She looked like a woman who had held herself together with both hands for 2 hours and was now standing in a hospital hallway in a blazer with dried blood on the left cuff, his blood, and eyes that were doing the thing where they were very bright and very controlled and one wrong word away from something else entirely. She looked at his bandaged side. Then at his face. How bad? She asked. Graze. 6 stitches. I've had worse. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be accurate. Something flickered in her expression, frustration, maybe, or the particular exasperation of a person who wanted comfort and kept receiving information instead. She crossed her arms. Uncrossed them. Looked at the floor. You should have let me come back with you, she said. You needed to be away from the scene. I needed to know you were. She stopped. Reset. Lifted her chin slightly in that way she did when she was reeling herself back in. I needed to know the situation was contained. Sure, Dex thought. That's what that was. The situation is contained, he said. Suspect is in custody. Hargrove is running a full debrief tonight. We'll have more answers by morning. Isla looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face, layered and complicated, the kind of expression that had too many things in it to name quickly. Then she nodded, once, briskly, and turned toward the exit. Okay, she said. Let's go. He shouldn't have been driving. Gerald had mildly suggested as much and Dex had ignored it with the complete serenity of a man who had been ignoring mild medical suggestions for a decade. He drove with his right hand. His left side pulled every time he shifted position and he let it, using the discomfort the way he'd been using it since they left the hospital, as something concrete to focus on. Something that wasn't the way the car felt too small, or the way Isla was sitting very still in the passenger seat staring out the window with her arms folded and her jaw set. They were 12 minutes from her building. 11 minutes of silence passed. You don't have to do that, Isla said. Do what? The wall thing. She said it without looking at him. You've been doing it since the hospital. Putting everything back where it was. Speaking in full professional sentences. Not looking at me for more than half a second. A pause. I notice things, Dex. He kept his eyes on the road. It was an acute situation, he said. Reactions in acute situations don't always reflect. Don't. Her voice was quiet but firm. Don't give me the debrief version of what happened. Silence. You held my face in your hands, she said. Softly. Not accusatory. Just honest, in the way she was sometimes startlingly honest, like she'd grown tired of the alternative. On that sidewalk. With sirens going off and you bleeding and the whole world falling apart, you held my face and you looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. She paused. I'm not going to pretend that was protocol. The traffic light ahead turned red. Dex stopped the car. He stared at the light. Isla. I'm not asking you to explain it, she said quickly. I'm not asking for anything. Her voice caught, almost imperceptibly. I just don't want you to act like it didn't happen. It happened. It can mean whatever it needs to mean. But it happened. The light stayed red. Dex's hands were at 10 and 2 on the wheel. Very still. She was right. That was the problem. She was precisely right, and he had spent the last 2 hours constructing a version of events that made the sidewalk manageable, that filed it under adrenaline response and protective instinct and professional context, and she had just taken that version apart in 4 quiet sentences. I have a rule, he said. I know. It exists for a reason. I know that too. I broke it. Yes. A breath. You did. Another beat of silence. The light turned green. He didn't move immediately, a half-second too long, and the car behind them tapped its horn gently. He drove. I'm not good at this, he said finally. His voice was different than it had been all day. Lower. The professional layer thinning in a way he couldn't fully prevent. Whatever this is. I don't do this. Do what? He gestured vaguely with his right hand, a small, uncharacteristic motion, almost helpless. This. Conversations like this. Feeling like, he stopped. Like what? She asked softly. He didn't answer. But she heard it anyway, in the silence that followed, the shape of what he hadn't said, the outline of a man who had locked something away for 3 years and was now standing in front of the door listening to it knock. She was almost asleep when the knock came. Not at her front door, at the door that separated her living room from the small guest area where Hargrove had arranged for Dex to stay overnight given the active threat status. Standard protocol, apparently. Isla had said nothing about it except fine, and had spent the subsequent 3 hours in her room alternating between staring at the ceiling and checking her phone and having the same internal argument on a loop. He's your bodyguard. He held your face. He's doing his job. He looked at you like you were the only thing that mattered. She pulled on a robe and opened the door. Dex was standing in the narrow hallway in a dark t-shirt and dark pants, barefoot, which for some reason was the most startlingly human she'd ever seen him look. He was holding 2 mugs. Steam curled from both of them. She stared at the mugs. I found the tea, he said. I didn't know what kind you wanted, so I made the one that smelled least like something medicinal. She looked up at his face. He was looking somewhere past her left shoulder with the focused neutrality of a man trying very hard to seem like this was a normal thing to be doing. She took the mug. Their fingers didn't touch. She noticed that he made sure of it. You can't sleep either, she said. I don't sleep well in unfamiliar spaces. How many unfamiliar spaces have you slept in? Enough. She leaned against the doorframe. He stayed in the hallway, exactly 1 careful step back, and she thought, there it is again. The distance. The recalibration. He had come to her door with tea at midnight, and was now maintaining the precise physical remove of a man who had decided the tea was as far as this was going. She let it be. For now. Can I ask you something? She said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. You usually do. The scar, she said. On your collarbone. What happened? Something shifted in his face. Not closing, more like considering. The way a person looked when they were deciding how much of the truth to give. Phoenix, he said. 3 years ago. Protection detail that went wrong. A pause. My partner took a bullet because I was distracted. Distracted how? He looked at her then. Directly, fully, the way he'd looked at her on the sidewalk. The wrong way, he said quietly. The hallway was very still. Somewhere outside, the city continued its relentless November business. Traffic, wind, the distant percussion of Chicago being Chicago. But in this hallway, with tea going cold in both their hands, something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. That's why the rule, she said. That's why the rule. She nodded slowly. Danny, your partner. Is he okay? Dex looked down at his mug. He walks with a limp. He doesn't blame me. A beat. I blame me. Dex. It's not a wound I need help with, he said quietly. Not harsh. Just honest, in the way she was starting to recognize as his version of honesty, blunt and clean and with no room for comfort he hadn't asked for. It's just the truth. She held her tea with both hands and looked at him, this careful, damaged, fiercely controlled man standing barefoot in her hallway at midnight, bleeding under his bandage and carrying something 3 years old and heavy as stone, and she felt something happen in her chest that she had no protocol for either. Okay, she said softly. I'll leave it alone. She paused. Tonight. The ghost of something, almost a smile, the second one she'd pulled from him in 3 days, moved across his face and disappeared. Good night, Isla. Good night, Dex. She started to close the door. Isla. She stopped. He was looking at the floor, one hand around his mug, jaw working slightly, like the words had somewhere further to travel before they arrived. I'm glad you're okay, he said. Simple. Direct. Like it cost him something real to say it out loud. She felt it land in her chest like something warm. I'm glad you're okay, she said back. She closed the door. And on the other side of it, she pressed her back against the wood and closed her eyes and stood very still, holding her tea, feeling the particular and terrifying sensation of falling towards something you hadn't planned for and couldn't stop. Across town, in a precinct interview room, the man in the gray jacket was answering questions he'd been rehearsing for weeks. He didn't mention the name he'd been given. He didn't mention the money. He didn't mention that this hadn't been personal, that Isla Monroe had simply been a means to an end in something much larger, much older, and much closer to her own life than a stranger in a parking garage. He didn't mention any of it. He just smiled at the detective across the table and said he wanted a lawyer, and waited. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the person trying to hurt you. The debrief changed everything. Not the way Isla had expected, not dramatically, not with raised voices or shock. It changed the way quiet things changed, slowly and underneath, like a current you didn't feel until you were already being moved by it. Dex sat across from her at her kitchen table on Friday morning with a manila folder open between them and his coffee untouched, and told her, in the measured cadence of a man delivering information he wished he didn't have, that the man in the gray jacket had not acted alone. His name is Terry Briggs, Dex said. He's a former employee of Monroe Property Group. He was let go 14 months ago after a contract dispute. But Hargrove's team found communication between Briggs and someone closer to your operation. A pause, brief and weighted. Someone with access to your personal accounts, your schedule, your parking garage code. Isla sat very still. How close? She asked. Dex looked at her steadily. We're still narrowing it down. But it's not an outsider, Isla. Someone in your immediate circle has been feeding information. The kitchen was full of November morning light, pale and clean and indifferent, and Isla sat in it and felt something she recognized from childhood, from the particular experience of growing up in a house where everything looked polished and something underneath was always quietly wrong. Betrayal. The specific cold of it. My father, she said carefully. Does he know? Hargrove briefed him this morning. And he wants you to come home. Dex's voice was neutral, but she'd learned to read the register underneath the neutral. To the family house in Kenilworth. He believes it's safer. Isla looked at the table. At the folder. At her own hands, flat against the wood. It's not safer, she said quietly. If the leak is inside my father's operation, Kenilworth is the least safe place I could be. She looked up. You know that. Yes, Dex said. I know that. A beat. Is that what you told Hargrove? That's what I told Hargrove. She held his gaze for a moment. This man who had, she was slowly understanding, been quietly and consistently on her side in every room she hadn't been in, and felt something shift in her chest with a slow, irreversible weight of a tide coming in. Thank you, she said. He closed the folder. We'll need to limit your movements for the next 72 hours. No scheduled appearances, no predictable routes. He paused. I know that's fine, she said. I'll work from here. He looked at her, that quick assessment that she'd learned wasn't only professional anymore, that had started including something else, something that lingered a half-second longer than it needed to on her face. Okay, he said. He picked up his coffee. Finally. 72 hours turned out to be a specific kind of extraordinary. Not because anything dramatic happened. The dramatic thing had already happened, was waiting in a precinct interview room across town and an investigation that would take weeks to resolve. The 72 hours were extraordinary because they were ordinary, and neither of them had expected that. Isla worked at her kitchen table with her laptop and her proposal documents spread around her in controlled chaos. Dex worked from the couch, laptop open, phone close, the constant low-level vigilance she'd stopped finding intrusive and started finding against all reason and self-preservation, deeply comforting. They didn't talk constantly. That was the thing she noticed first. Dex was not a man who filled silence with noise, and she'd grown up in a house where silence was always loaded with something. Her father's disapproval, her mother's careful diplomacy, the particular tension of a family that communicated primarily through what it didn't say. This silence was different. It had room in it. By the first afternoon, she'd started making 2 cups of coffee without asking. By the second morning, he'd started leaving the specific section of the newspaper she liked, the arts and culture pages, which she read with the focused pleasure of someone reclaiming a small piece of themselves, on the kitchen table before she woke up. She noticed. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They watched a movie Friday night, her suggestion, delivered casually, almost daring him to decline, and he hadn't, just moved from the couch to the armchair with his coffee and watched the movie with the same focused attention he brought to everything. Halfway through, she tucked her feet under her and glanced over and found him already watching the screen with the faintest trace of something on his face that she eventually identified as enjoyment. She looked back at the screen and smiled to herself. There you are. It was Saturday afternoon when everything opened up. Isla was at the kitchen counter making soup, real soup from scratch, because cooking was the thing she did when she needed to feel like she had her hands on something real, and Dex was at the table reading something on his laptop when she said, without fully planning to, "My mother left when I was 11. The apartment went quiet in a particular way, the way it went quiet when something true had just been said out loud for the first time in a while. Dex looked up from his laptop. She didn't leave the country or anything dramatic, Isla said, stirring, keeping her eyes on the pot. It was easier sometimes to say hard things when you had something to do with your hands. She just left my father's world. Walked out of the house in Kenilworth with 2 suitcases and moved to a small apartment in Wicker Park and started painting." She paused. "She's actually really good. She shows at a gallery on Milwaukee Avenue now. Do you see her? Twice a month. We have lunch." A small, complicated breath. "My father considers it a betrayal that I maintain the relationship. He doesn't say it directly. He just gets a certain look." "The look," Dex said quietly. She glanced over. "You know it." "My father had one too." He looked back at his laptop, then closed it, a deliberate motion she noticed. Choosing the conversation. He wasn't a bad man. He was just absent in all the ways that counted and present in all the ways that hurt. Isla set down her spoon. "When did he leave?" she asked. "He didn't." That was almost the harder thing. Dex turned his coffee mug in both hands, that gesture she'd started reading as him working through something. He was there every day. Just never there. A pause. "My brother dealt with it by being loud about everything. I dealt with it by learning to need nothing." "That's not dealing with it," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him across the kitchen, this man who had told her, just now, the thing that explained everything. The control. The distance. The rule. The careful, impenetrable self-sufficiency of a person who had learned young that needing something meant being let down by the specific absence of it. She understood that. She understood it in the way you only understood things that lived in you too. "I used to make my father come to my school performances," she said, turning back to the soup. "Every year. Science fairs, debate competitions, the spring concert in 5th grade where I played a completely terrible recorder solo." A breath of almost laughter. He came to all of them. Always in the back. Always left early for a call or a meeting. She stirred slowly. "I used to tell myself the showing up was the point. That it counted even if he was already out the door before the applause." "Did you believe it?" "For a long time." A pause. "Less now." The soup simmered. The city moved outside the window. Dex was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was actually sitting with something rather than filing it away. "The pitch meeting," he said. "The sustainable development proposal. Your father doesn't know about it." She turned to look at him. He was watching her steadily. "No," she said. "Is that why it matters so much?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Partly. But mostly it matters because it's good. Because I built it and it's genuinely good and it has nothing to do with the Monroe name." She met his eyes. "I want to make something that's mine. Just mine." Something in Dex's face did the thing she'd been watching it do for days. That slow, reluctant opening, like a door being inched forward by someone who wasn't sure what was on the other side. "It's good," he said quietly. "The proposal. I read the summary on the table Wednesday morning. I shouldn't have." A pause. "It's good, Isla. It's really good." She stared at him. She had pitched this proposal to 3 professionals in a glass-walled conference room, and their interest had felt like a victory. But Dex Carter saying it's really good in her kitchen on a Saturday afternoon in a voice with no performance in it whatsoever, that landed somewhere different. Somewhere deeper. "You read my proposal," she said. "It was on the table," he said. "I have a problem with reading things that are in front of me. You could have said something sooner. I didn't think it was my place." She turned back to the soup so he wouldn't see her face doing whatever it was currently doing. "It's your place," she said quietly. "For the record." The silence that followed was the warmest silence she'd ever stood inside. After dinner, which they ate at the table, side by side rather than across from each other, a shift that happened without discussion, Isla brought out a bottle of red wine that had been sitting in her cabinet since a dinner party 3 months ago and set 2 glasses on the counter. Dex looked at the glasses. "I'm technically on duty," he said. "You're technically off duty until 6 a.m., she said. "Your words." He looked at the glasses again. Then at her. The ghost of the almost smile. He sat down. She poured 2 glasses and they moved to the living room, and the city glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she pulled her feet under her on the couch, her default position, which she'd stopped apologizing for being undignified, and he sat at the other end, turned slightly toward her, jacket off for the first time since she'd met him, and she was acutely aware of how much space he didn't take up and how much space he somehow filled anyway. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You usually don't." The almost smile again. Warmer this time. "The guy from the pitch meeting. Your assistant mentioned he called twice this week." Isla blinked. "Are you asking about my personal life?" "I'm asking about a repeated contact with an unknown individual during an active threat situation," he said, with the perfect composure of a man using professional language to ask a thoroughly unprofessional question. She looked at him for a long moment. A slow smile started somewhere in her chest and made its way to her face. "His name is Brett," she said. "He's an investor I met at a conference in September. He's perfectly nice and completely uninteresting, and I have no intention of calling him back." She paused. "Any other security concerns I can address for you?" Dex looked at his wine glass. "No," he said. "That covers it." She laughed. It surprised her, the fullness of it, real and unguarded, the kind of laugh that happened when your defenses had quietly packed up and left without telling you. Dex looked at her when she laughed. Really looked at her. Not the scan. Not the assessment. The look she'd seen twice now, on the sidewalk in the hallway, the one that lived underneath everything he'd built and couldn't quite be kept under when she was laughing or honest or standing in morning light making coffee. She felt it. She met his eyes. The laughter faded, but the warmth of it stayed, hovering between them like the last light before dark, precious and brief, and both of them aware, with the acute consciousness of people who had talked themselves out of things before, that this moment was the kind that changed the shape of what came after. "Dex," she said softly. "Don't," he said. Just as softly. "I wasn't going to say anything dangerous." "You don't have to." His voice was low. "The way you say my name is already—" He stopped. A breath. His jaw worked slightly in that way she'd come to know. Isla. Her name in his mouth. Just that. She felt it everywhere. "I know," she said quietly. "I know all the reasons. There are a lot of them. I know. I don't have a good track record with," he stopped again. She watched him work through it, this man who could dismantle a security protocol in 10 minutes and couldn't finish the sentence. "I don't know how to do this without it costing someone something." "Maybe that's just what love costs," she said. And then heard herself. Her eyes widened slightly. Dex went very still. "I didn't mean," she started. "I know what you meant," he said. A beat. "Did you?" he asked quietly. She held his gaze. The city glittered. Her wine glass was warm in both her hands. The truth was right there, simple and terrifying, and already said. "Yes," she said. "I meant it." He exhaled slowly. His hand, resting on the couch between them, moved 1 inch, maybe 2, toward hers. Not touching. Just the distance between them made deliberately, visibly smaller. She looked at his hand. Then at his face. "We have terrible timing," she said. "The worst," he agreed. "There's still an active threat." "Yes." "And you work for my father's security firm." "Technically for Hargrove, who was hired by your father, yes." "And you have a rule." His eyes were dark and steady, and doing the thing she had no defense against. "Had," he said quietly. Past tense. She turned her hand over on the couch cushion. Palm up. Open. An offering. A choice. His to make. He looked at her hand for a long moment, this careful, wounded, fiercely disciplined man standing at the edge of everything he'd spent 3 years protecting himself from. His hand moved the last inch. His fingers closed over hers. Not a kiss. Not a declaration. Just his hand holding her hand in the dark warmth of her living room while Chicago glittered outside, and something between them that had been building since a doorway and a coffee mug and a professional voice that asked 0 personal questions became, quietly and irrevocably, real. They sat like that for a long time. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Subscribe, like, and drop a comment below. Tell us if you've ever held someone's hand in the dark and known, just known, that everything was about to change. Dex and Isla's story deserves to be seen. Don't let it end here. The name came through on Sunday morning. Dex was at the kitchen table with his laptop and his coffee and Isla's cultural pages folded beside his elbow. He'd stopped pretending that wasn't a habit now, when his phone buzzed with a message from Hargrove's lead investigator that made him set down his mug with a careful, deliberate stillness that meant the opposite of calm. He read it twice. Then he closed his laptop, stood up, and walked to the window. Stood there for a moment looking at the Chicago skyline doing its cold November business, indifferent and vast and unhelpful. The leak wasn't a low-level employee. It wasn't a disgruntled assistant or a compromised IT contractor. It was Priya, Isla's assistant. Her closest professional confidant. The woman who had been in the room for every meeting, every schedule change, every private phone call for 3 years. The woman who had called Isla the morning this all started and said the emails weren't vague with the careful, practiced concern of someone who already knew exactly how vague they were because she'd helped write them. Dex understood, in the way he understood things he'd rather not, what this was going to do to Isla. He heard her door open. The soft sounds of her morning, the bathroom, the closet, the particular cadence of a person moving through their own space with the ease of someone who had, over the past 3 days, stopped performing for an audience. She came into the kitchen in a worn northwestern sweatshirt and dark leggings, hair loose, feet bare. No armor. Just her. She looked at him standing at the window and stopped. "What happened?" she said. He turned around. He watched her read his face. She was good at that, better than most people he'd worked with, better than she probably knew, and he watched the lightness of her Sunday morning begin to change. "Tell me," she said quietly. "Sit down." Dex. "Isla, sit down." She sat. He came to the table and sat across from her and told her, directly and without the softening that would have been a disservice to her, what Hargrove's investigator had found. He watched her face while he told her. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. She sat with both hands flat on the table, the same posture she'd had when he'd told her about the parking garage code, about the insider leak, every time the world had delivered information she'd rather not have received. And she listened and she absorbed it with a particular self-containment of a woman who had learned early that falling apart was a luxury that cost too much. When he finished, she nodded once. Then she stood up, walked to the counter, picked up her coffee mug, and stood at the window with her back to him. He waited. 3 years, she said finally. Her voice was flat in a way that was worse than breaking. She knew about my mother's gallery. She knew about the proposal. She knew, a breath that wasn't quite steady. She threw me a birthday party last April. She said she was proud of me. Dex said nothing. This was not a moment for information or strategy or professional assessment. He understood that. Why? Isla's voice, still at the window. Money. Briggs had a contact inside Monroe Property Group, a senior executive who stood to lose significantly if your independent proposal succeeded and drew your father's attention and investment away from existing projects. He paused. Priya was approached 8 months ago. She was paid considerably. A long silence. "She was my friend," Isla said. 2 words with an entire excavation inside them. Dex stood up. He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the window. Not in front of her, not behind her, beside her, which was something he hadn't calculated and didn't try to. He just stood there, shoulder close to hers, both of them looking at the city. After a moment, Isla's hand found his. Not the gentle, uncertain reaching of last night. This was different. This was a grip, fingers tight through his, holding on. He held back. Firmly. Both hands now, his wrapped around hers. She pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder. Not collapsing. Just landing. The way a person landed when they'd been holding something heavy for too long and found something solid enough to lean against for one moment. He turned slightly and pressed his lips to the top of her head, and it was the quietest, most deliberate thing he had ever done. "I've got you," he said. The same words as the sidewalk. Different weight now. No sirens. No crowd. No adrenaline to blame it on. Just true. Richard Monroe arrived at 11. Dex had expected him. Had, in fact, spoken to Hargrove that morning and been told that Richard Monroe was on his way and would be expecting a full briefing and would almost certainly bring Douglas Vane, his attorney, which he did. Richard Monroe was a tall man in his early 60s with a kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled into commanding. Silver-haired, expensively suited, carrying the absolute confidence of a man who had never been in a room he didn't consider his. He came through Isla's front door with Douglas Vane at his shoulder and looked at the apartment the way he always looked at it, Dex observed, like he was assessing the value of an asset. His eyes landed on Dex. Then on Isla. Then on the specific way Isla was standing. Not beside Dex, not close enough to touch, but in the particular alignment of 2 people who had recently been touching and had rearranged themselves only marginally. And something moved through Richard Monroe's face that was too controlled to be called an expression. Isla. He crossed the room and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her with the assessed warmth of a man who loved his daughter and had never quite learned how to do it in a way that felt like anything other than management. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Dad. I want you to come home. The house in Kenilworth has full security. I've already spoken to Hargrove about upgrading the—" "I'm not coming to Kenilworth." A pause. The attorney shifted his weight. Richard Monroe's hands dropped from her shoulders. "Isla. The leak originated from inside your operation," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd had an hour to get there, but she was there. "Priya had access to my information because she was embedded in my professional life, and she was embedded in my professional life because my entire professional life has been adjacent to yours. The threat didn't come from outside. It came from the inside of the world you built." She held his gaze. "I'm safer here." Richard Monroe looked at her for a moment. Dex watched him process it, the argument, the precision of it, the quality of her steadiness, and recalibrate. Then Richard Monroe looked at Dex. The look was long and specific and contained several questions that weren't about security. "Mr. Carter," he said, "can I have a moment with my daughter?" "Dad." "It's fine," Dex said quietly. He moved to the hallway. He didn't go far. He wasn't wired to go far. He heard Richard Monroe's voice, lower now, "Who is he to you?" And Isla's, clear and unhesitating, "Someone I trust." A pause. "Isla. That's all I'm going to say about it right now." A breath. "But I need you to hear something, and I need you to actually listen, not manage." Silence. "I built something," she said, "on my own. 18 months of work that has nothing to do with your name or your money or your approval. And it's good, Dad. It's really good. And someone in your world tried to bury it before you even knew it existed because they were afraid of what it meant for their own interests." Her voice, still steady, now carrying something underneath it, something that had been waiting for this specific conversation for years. "I need you to understand that the most dangerous thing in my life right now is not the man in the gray jacket. It's the assumption that everything I am belongs inside the world you built." The silence that followed was the longest in the apartment. Dex stood in the hallway with his eyes closed. God, he thought. She's something. Richard Monroe left 2 hours later. He had not agreed to everything. He was not, Dex suspected, a man who processed seismic shifts in an afternoon. But he had sat at his daughter's kitchen table and listened, actually listened, with the particular quality of a man hearing something he'd been avoiding, And before he left, he had put his hand on Isla's shoulder again and said quietly, "Send me the proposal." And something in Isla's face had done something that Dex felt in his chest from across the room. Douglas Vane had said nothing of note. Lawyers rarely did in rooms where the important things were being said. The door closed. Isla stood in the middle of her living room and exhaled a breath so long and complete it seemed to contain the entire last 4 days. Then she turned around and looked at Dex. He was leaning against the hallway entrance, arms loose at his sides, watching her with a look that he'd stopped trying to keep from his face sometime in the last 24 hours. "You heard all of that," she said. "Most of it. I said he could have a moment with me. I stayed in the hallway." Dex. Isla. She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, that real unguarded laugh, the one that had undone him on the couch 2 nights ago, and shook her head. "Come here," she said. He pushed off the wall. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, closer than protocol, closer than the careful geometry he'd been maintaining for days, and looked at her, and she looked back, and there was nothing between them now. No rule. No distance. No careful, constructed nothing. Just this. Just them. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Okay." "When I pulled you into me on that sidewalk," he stopped, jaw working slightly, finding his way through it. "It wasn't instinct. I mean it was, but not the training kind." He met her eyes. "It was the other kind. The kind I've been shutting down for 3 years because the last time I felt it, someone got hurt." Dex. "I'm not finished." He'd never said that to her before. She went quiet. "I've been telling myself since Thursday morning that the sidewalk was adrenaline. That the hallway was just tea. That last night was just proximity. Circumstances." He exhaled. "That's not what it was." She searched his face. "What was it?" "You," he said simply. "It was just you." She reached up and put her hand flat against his chest, mirror image of the sidewalk, his blood then, his heartbeat now, and felt him breathe. "I'm scared," she said honestly. "For the record. I'm not someone who does this easily. I know. I don't know how to do this while my life is this complicated." "Neither do I." "And you still work for Hargrove." "I'll deal with Hargrove. And my father." Isla. His hand came up and covered hers against his chest. Warm and firm and certain. "I know all the reasons. I know all of them. I've been listing them since the lobby of your building on Thursday morning." His thumb moved against her hand, the echo of a gesture on a sidewalk, deliberate and tender. "None of them are bigger than this." She looked at him. This careful, damaged, fiercely loving man who had spent 3 years learning to need nothing and had spent 4 days quietly, systematically, and entirely accidentally falling for her in the spaces between coffee and cultural pages and a couch at midnight. "None of them?" she asked softly. "Not one," he said. She rose up onto her toes and kissed him. It was soft and unhurried, not desperate, not consuming, nothing like the movie version of a first kiss between 2 people who'd been circling each other through danger and late nights and too much unsaid. It was careful. Deliberate. The kiss of 2 people who had both been careful for too long and were choosing, with full awareness of the cost, to stop. His hand moved to her face, both hands, cradling her jaw with the same tenderness as a thumb against a tear on a sidewalk, and he kissed her back with 3 years of locked doors opening all at once, quietly, like a house finally being let breathe. When they pulled back, her forehead rested against his. Both of them breathing. The city outside, vast and glittering and relentless, continued without comment. "Hi," she said softly. Something happened in his face that she had never seen there before, open and unguarded and completely, devastatingly real. He smiled. Not the ghost of one. Not the almost. The full, actual thing, slow and warm and transforming his face into something she realized she would spend a considerable amount of time wanting to see again. "Hi," he said back. 3 weeks later, Isla walked into a conference room on Michigan Avenue and presented her proposal to a room of 11 people, including 2 city council representatives, a sustainability investment fund, and her father. She wore a dark blazer and her hair down and no armor she hadn't chosen for herself. She presented for 47 minutes. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment, the specific high-quality quiet of people who had just been genuinely moved by something. And then Richard Monroe, sitting at the far end of the table, did something she had not seen him do in a professional setting in her entire adult life. He started the applause. She stood at the head of the table and felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't known was still locked. Some last remaining piece of the girl who had watched her father leave early from her recorder recital and told herself the showing up was the point. He had stayed. He was still clapping. She looked at the back of the room. Dex was there, standing near the wall, dark jacket, no tie, the correct professional distance from a woman who was no longer technically his client but whom he had driven here this morning and kissed in the elevator and told quietly, in the specific voice that still made her feel like the only thing that mattered, "You've got this." He was watching her with that look. She held it for just a moment, just one, private and full and entirely theirs, and then she looked back at the room and thanked everyone for their time. Later, on the drive home, she reached across and put her hand over his on the gear shift. He turned his palm up. Their fingers locked together. He drove with one hand through the Chicago streets, late afternoon light slanting gold through the windows, the city doing its vast and beautiful thing all around them. "You were incredible in there," he said. "Don't make me cry in the car." "I'm being accurate." "I know." She squeezed his hand. "I know you are." A comfortable silence settled, the kind they'd built over weeks now, that had room in it, that neither of them needed to fill. The kind that felt, she thought, like home in a way that had nothing to do with an address. Dex. Thank you. She said it simply. The way he said things when he meant them all the way through. For the rule you broke. For the way you broke it. He glanced over at her. That slow, full smile, the one she was, yes, absolutely collecting. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being worth breaking it for." She looked out the window at Chicago streaming past, beautiful and complicated and fully, finally hers, and held his hand and felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, exactly like herself. Not managed. Not protected. Not performing. Just Isla. Loved. And sometimes that's how it starts, not with perfect timing or clean circumstances or love that asks nothing of you. Sometimes it starts with a rule. And someone worth breaking it for. And two people brave enough to choose each other anyway.